Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another packed event at ThinkTent. My name's Mark Littlewood. I'm the director of Pop Conversations, and this is our third today, with a very, very special guest indeed. For those of you who follow British politics very closely, you might be aware that the Conservative Party is in the midst of a leadership election. And one candidate in particular has said that he thinks all four of the candidates left should be subjected to the maximum scrutiny possible in the course of this leadership election. And we at PopCon are here to serve. So please give a very warm welcome to the stage to our former Immigration Minister and a candidate for leader of the Conservative Party, the Right Honourable Robert Jenrick. Great to have you.
Nice to see you.
So yeah, Robert, you said you wanted a lot of scrutiny.
So I hope I don't live to regret saying that.
So I'll start with a really, really difficult question. How's it going?
Keep these questions going. Well, I'm having a good conference, aren't you?
Yeah,
seems to be a very positive atmosphere. That's great. No, look, I have loved every minute of the leadership contest so far. I've been to all 4 nations of the UK. I've done 100 events. But more importantly, I have been putting forward my view that when a party suffers a defeat as serious as ours, which was a comprehensive defeat, it was a worst defeat in our nation, our party's history. I mean, you've got to go back to like the 18th century to find defeats like this. No government has gone on to win so few seats, so few votes than we did at this election. You've got to change. You can't just put your fingers in your ears and hope that things will be different, that the electorate will have buyer's remorse, will come back to you. You've got to change. And I stand for change. I want us to change our operation as a party. I want us to change our offer to the country. I think if we can do that, then we can begin to rebuild the public's trust and confidence.
Great. Well, let's dive into some of these things, because I think potentially the biggest single policy issue in the leadership campaign so far has been ECHR, nearly overtaken by maternity pay yesterday, but probably ECHR. And of the candidates in the field, you're the one who's most adamant, we must leave, based, I think, on your experience as Immigration Minister and your principled resignation from that position. Some of the others are saying, well, maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't, perhaps we don't need to, there are other ways around it. What has led you to the conclusion that actual full departure from ECHR is necessary? How will it make immigration and asylum policy easier under your premiership if you become our PM in 2029?
Very good question. And you're right to say that it's one of the central dividing lines of this leadership contest. And I think that the leadership contest should be a cauldron of debate. I don't think that we should just put off these issues and handle them in years to come. Firstly, that cuts all of you out of these debates. It means that they're just done in smoke-filled rooms amongst members of the parliamentary party in the future. And secondly, it's a recipe for division and for more loss of the trust and confidence of the public. I stand for, on this issue, having a very crystal clear position. Mine is for leave. Mine is for leaving the ECHR. I don't come to this from an ideological perspective, although I do believe that our people and our parliament should be sovereign, and I do believe that a country that created Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights and a habeas corpus is perfectly capable of drafting our own British Bill of Rights and enshrining our liberties and freedoms in English law. I come to it primarily from a practical perspective. I saw at the Home Office that there are criminals, dangerous foreign criminals in our country who we cannot remove because of the ECHR. Last week, you may have read, a Ugandan who literally clubbed someone to death in the back of an ambulance in London had his deportation quashed by a British court on the grounds that under the ECHR, Uganda could not guarantee his mental health. It's absurd, but it's also shameful. It is also preventing us from removing dangerous terrorists from our country. I'll give you another example. Wabi Mohammed, an individual from Somalia who attempted to kill hundreds of people on the London Underground weeks after 7/7. His plot was foiled. He went to prison for 17 years, was released halfway through his sentence. We tried to deport him back home. We were not able to, for fear that back home he might be persecuted. It was under the ECHR. That is outrageous. I'm not prepared to have that happen again. And then you had, of course, the whole issue of illegal migration more generally. The Supreme Court said we couldn't follow through on our Rwanda policy. Their principal argument, not their only one, but their principal argument was it was contrary to the ECHR. We can't get terrorists out of our country. We can't get dangerous foreign criminals out of our country. We can't secure our borders whilst we remain within the court. And the court, as Jonathan Sumption, one of our leading jurists, has said, is now straying into all manner of other aspects of our life. They're telling the Swiss what their net zero policy should be, even though they had a referendum on it. They told us that we can't send to jail the people who took down the Edward Colston statue in kind of blatant mob violence on the streets of Bristol. And they're telling us how our special forces should behave when they're on dangerous assignments overseas. They're actually writing laws which we do not want and we haven't voted for. I think that's wrong. Now, you're right, Mark, that there are those who say, fine, it needs to be reformed. That is a fantasy. Reform requires the unanimous consent of 46 member states, from Iceland to Andorra to Turkey to Hungary. Never going to happen. I've not met anyone who believes that it could happen. In fact, nobody even says, ask anyone who says that, what clause do you want to change? Who are your allies on this? What's the process of doing this? I have not met a single one of the leadership contenders or any of my parliamentary colleagues who can tell you that. It would be both as doomed to fail as David Cameron's attempt to renegotiate our membership of the EU, and ultimately as harmful to us as a party because it would be a process of decades. And I don't think, Mark, the public want to mess around. If we were given a second chance in government, we're not going to be given a third chance. The public just want us to get on and do this, secure our borders, fix these problems for the British people.
So, I guess, Robert, some of your opponents in this leadership race are saying, well, that all sounds well and good, but why are other countries able to apparently navigate ECHR rather than better than we are? Why, there seems to be a peculiar British problem here. Why is it we're peculiarly bad at it? And just to be clear here, it's ECHR, you'd repeal the Human Rights Act, and would you replace it with something? Would there be some, because the plan for a British Bill of Rights under Dominic Raab and others sort of never came to fruition. How sort of easily can that be done? What comes into its place? What goes into that void? So why do we seem to be peculiarly hamstrung by this compared to other signatories, and what replaces it under a Jenrick premiership?
Well, I think the UK is an unusual country because we're a common law country. And so what we find in this country is that as soon as there is a judgment by the Strasbourg court, there are copycat cases that come forward, often in very large numbers, because you know that there are so many legal representatives, NGOs and so on in this whole space of counter-terrorism, foreign national offenders, immigration cases. And so very quickly, our own courts start to take into account the judgments in Strasbourg. It begins to seep into our common law to change judicial practice in a way which does not happen in most other European countries. So we're almost uniquely ill-equipped to deal with a Strasbourg court that has become so activist. I also think that the UK is a country of laws. We are not a country that routinely ignores the judgments of courts. We're not Turkey. We're not Hungary. We're not a country where the leader of the day just says to hell with what the court says. And it's also not an intellectually honest argument to say, we're going to remain within something, but you know what? On one of the central issues of the day, we're actually just going to ignore everything that it says. I would rather we were honest with the public and with ourselves and moved forward and did something differently. And that's to create a British Bill of Rights. Now, I have great respect for Dominic Raab, who begun the process of considering how to create a British Bill of Rights. But the problem that he encountered was, you couldn't create a meaningful British Bill of Rights whilst you remain within the European
okay.
Convention on Human Rights. He tried for years, a highly intelligent person, to square this circle. And it was impossible, because the benefits of a British Bill of Rights whilst you remain within the ECHR were so minimal that it wasn't worth the effort. So what I want to do is, let's involve great jurists like Jonathan Sumption, the great legal minds of our generation. Let's draft a British Bill of Rights. And I think as Conservatives, that creates an amazing opportunity for us, because there are rights that we believe in as Conservatives which are under threat in the world today. I mean, freedom of speech is an obvious one. And I rather think that we could create a British Bill of Rights which not just enshrines these rights in British English law, but actually enhances them, updates them for the challenges we face today. Property rights, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. And we would create something new, which was a beacon to democracies and aspirant democracies around the world.
Okay. Now, I guess on ECHR in particular, Robert, but possibly in a number of areas, some commentators would say Robert Jenrick's been on quite the political journey. Now, I'm rather in favour of this myself. 25 years ago, I was a wet, lily-livered, fanatically pro-EU liberal, and now I'm not, right? To put it mildly. And I think this is intriguing and to be warmly welcomed. Particularly, it's obviously your experience as Immigration Minister, where you took the difficult decision to resign upon principle. But tell us a little bit about how your approach to politics, or even your philosophy as a Conservative, has changed, perhaps, over the last 2 or 5 years. Because I think it would be fair to say a lot of people, if they were asked 5, 10 years ago, would have said, well, Robert Jenrick, sort of, Cameroony type, bit middle of the road. And you're now actually coming across, I think, as by far the most radical of the 4 leadership candidates. What's been in your political career or experience in recent times that's put you on that journey, or haven't you really been on one?
Well, I think it's fair to say that my views have evolved over time. I don't think my values have changed, incidentally. I mean, I think my values, in fact, were cast not so far from here, where I grew up in Wolverhampton. My mum and dad came to this region as working class people, started a business around our kitchen table. My values have always been aspiration, family, free enterprise, patriotism. But I do think that you're right to say that for much of my time in politics, I've been a member of Parliament for 10 years, I served in the governments of each of the last 5 Conservative Prime Ministers. I broadly thought our political system worked.
Yeah.
And I tried to work within it. And I prided myself on doing a good job, whether that's getting the number of new homes built up to the highest level since Margaret Thatcher, trying to slash red tape for some small businesses when I was Community Secretary, or indeed when I started at the Home Office. But then over time, particularly in the last few years, I did come to the view, a very firm view, that the British political system is not working. In fact, it's fundamentally broken. I saw when I was Community Secretary during the pandemic that you had a state that was simultaneously overbearing, telling people what to do, and yet barring a couple of things like the vaccine rollout, was powerless. You had, as Housing Secretary, a planning system that prevented us from doing things that were overwhelmingly in the national interest, like building nuclear power stations or roads or railways. Data centres on the outskirts of Oxford and Cambridge, which our economy desperately needed. And then as Immigration Minister, I saw the state unable to do its most basic function: keep the borders of our country secure, keep the public safe. And so I came to the view that not only is the state that I had been part of, that I had tried to uphold, broken, but it's actually contributing to our national decline. And that we are facing a series of massive challenges, not unique. Most Western countries are in the same place. Mass migration, flatlining economic growth, unsustainable public services, a contested issue of climate change and how we tackle that. And in most, if not all of those issues and more, our system is not working. And there's a series of stale, consensus views that are driving our country into the ground. And we have a choice. Do we go along with that? Or do we have the courage to do something different? And that is what I want to do now. That's what I tried to do as Immigration Minister. That is what I want our party to do now. Because I do not believe this Labour government is going to do that. For a government that is so fresh, it is so stale. They do not have the answers to the big challenges facing our country. So it's on us.
Yep.
It's incumbent on us to bring them forwards.
So I was fascinated, Robert, when I heard you in your recent interview with, I think it was Katie Balls at The Spectator, that you said something that chimes almost entirely with popular conservatism's mission, which was, it's our analysis, if you like, that the institutional infrastructure of the UK is now geared against conservative ends, almost wherever you might look, be this the ECHR and human rights lawyers, but in a range of other places. You might argue that the Climate Change Committee has far more power than the Environment Secretary, for example, that we seem to have lost parliamentary sovereignty in a whole range of areas and have a kind of bureaucratic state that is in charge. Do you think that accounts for what I think most people in this room would say was disappointing progress from 2010 to 2024? It's not at all obvious we've left the country in a more conservative state than we found it in, right? So widening out from the ECHR, do you think this is a wider problem with the institutional infrastructure, and how do you fix that beyond the immigration brief in a whole range of domestic settings as well?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, my fundamental analysis of why we lost the election is not about left or right. It's that we just failed to deliver for the British public on the central issues facing our country, the most prominent of which were immigration, but the economy and our public services. And in fact, however you dice our electorate, Labour voters, Lib Dem voters, Reform voters, Conservative voters, it's those three issues people keep saying in different orders. And we have to deliver for them again. So if we're lucky enough to get into government in the future, we've got to make sure we do things better next time. What I think we've got to do is think very carefully in this enforced period of opposition as to how we can reform our civil service, how we can address the sheer plethora of quangos that have come up over recent years, of which, of course, there will be more under the Labour Party, which deny ministers the authority, the accountability that we need. So even when you have really good ministers, we're not managers or technocrats, who want to do things, they struggle to do it. I remember my permanent secretary saying to me, "Don't get involved, Minister, in operational matters," as if it's not my responsibility, when we had probably the world's worst passport agency to try and turn this thing around. Well, I want to know, are people working overtime? What are the targets? How long does it take to do each part of the process? We've got to a point where those things are not normal for ministers. And then you do have a legal framework now, which we didn't address in the early days of our government, perhaps because of the coalition, but also because we didn't have the will to do it. As you say, the Climate Change Act, the Human Rights Act, the Equalities Act, and more. Mostly things which have noble intentions, which are superficially very attractive to the electorate. So we have to approach it with a degree of care. But I want us to use this time to think very carefully about which of these are really working in the interests of the public, which ones should go, which should be reformed, which should be amended. And I've said that we should create a great reform act where we look to leave the ECHR, to repeal the HRA, and to think through each of these other laws and work out which ones need to change.
Okay,
I think that would be a great reform for a future Conservative government.
And that could almost be the first grand act of a putative future Jenrick administration.
It would
right?
be.
And you know, I'm not asking you to write the party's next manifesto now, but this is the direction of travel, right? And just mention a bit more without, you know, I'm not trying to get you to overcommit. There's a leadership race going on, and then we've got the luxury of a good amount of time to build a manifesto for Britain. Civil service reform, what do you think's gone wrong in the civil service in recent years?
Well, a number of things. It's too large. So a great deal of good work was done in the early days of the coalition government under Francis Maude and others, which reduced it. It's increased in size dramatically under the guise of Brexit and then COVID, to the point where we could reduce it by 100,000 positions, and still it would only go back to the point it was in 2015. You know, I have no idea why Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have cancelled the plan that Jeremy Hunt put in place to reduce, I think, by 60,000 positions, but they have. Well, I do know why, because their revealed preference is to bow to their union paymasters. But that's the first thing we should do. But it is bigger than just that. I think there's also been a real erosion in meritocracy within the civil service over a much longer period than that. Of course we want to see people from a multitude of backgrounds come into our civil service, but we should also be thinking about merit and a diversity of views. And I remember when I was housing secretary and I proposed taking part of the department to Wolverhampton, and the outrage within the department at the idea that the civil service could be moved to Wolverhampton, of all places. You know, maybe it could be Leeds or Manchester at a push, but not somebody in somewhere as, you know, provincial as Wolverhampton. Well, I think you've got to get merit and a diversity of thought back into it. And then it's about accountability. There is not a culture of accountability within the civil service today. The route to prospering is rarely by doing things which are novel or imaginative, taking a calculated risk, doing what ministers want, but which might be contrary to the system's view. That's got to change.
And do you think that civil service has become more politicised, or perhaps just more monolithic and groupthink in the way it approaches things? I mean, with the Director General of the BBC, I remember having a conversation on this diversity thing as well. I slightly caught him unawares by saying I was extremely interested in his diversity targets. But I followed up by saying I wanted to know how many of his editors and senior political journalists voted for Brexit, which was not a diversity of view. Do you think there's become, in the civil service, a kind of monoculture of a kind of leftist progressive approach, which is now almost unanimous?
Yeah, broadly speaking, I do. I mean, I tended to find in my own personal experience with the civil service that it was more cock-up than conspiracy. And that the depressing reality was that it was not that there were Machiavellian masterminds trying to undermine our policies, but there were people who were just not very competent.
Right, yeah.
And there wasn't a great deal of accountability. So that would be the main thing I would try and do. But you're right, I think there is a depressing degree of groupthink on a number of issues, and that needs to change. I don't want to politicize the civil service, but equally I don't think it's sensible that you walk into a government department of 10 or 20,000 civil servants with two 25-year-old special advisors and hope to turn it around.
Yeah.
No disrespect to some former special advisors I see in the audience here. I don't want to fall out with them. But I think you've got to do something a bit different.
Yeah.
You know, if you walk into the Home Office in 5 years' time, I think you've got to go in with the ability to remove people who don't agree with your program or who are not succeeding.
Yeah.
You know, you've got to be able to walk in and say, well, let's have a general counsel of the Home Office who is an esteemed lawyer, but comes at these issues from a can-do, more conservative-minded perspective, rather than simply relying on the government legal services perspective.
Okay.
That's the kind of approach I would take.
So I want to pick up on you were saying, you know, your values have been very consistent, and you know, and perhaps the policy means by which you go about prosecuting those missions has changed after your political experience. But there was one that you touched on that I want to tease out, because it really annoyed me on the TV interviews, not you, the interviewer. It goes to patriotism, which you've made, I thought, what was a great point about English identity being suppressed in a way which isn't true of the other three parts of our kingdom, and is unusual in foreign countries as well. And then you're immediately asked by an interviewer, okay, sum up English identity in 3 words or something, and you're like, what are you supposed to say? Cricket, warm beer, I don't know. But we've got the luxury of this not being a 3-minute interview. Tell me a little about your worries about English identity being suppressed or people not being out and proud about it. And what does it mean to you? Not in just sort of 3 or 4 words, because these are incredibly amorphous things, national identity, but just because they're amorphous and nebulous doesn't mean they're not vital.
Yeah, well, I felt it was important to talk about cultural identity, and in particular about English identity. Mm-hmm. You know, I think if you were a Scottish or a Welsh politician, it would be perfectly normal for you to talk about your national identity, and for you to take great pride in the fact that you had British identity, but also Welsh or Scottish identity. In fact, no TV presenter would even ask you, what does it mean to be Scottish or to be Welsh? Just as we wouldn't really ask a Frenchman or an Italian, what does it mean? But there's something peculiar about English identity where we feel ashamed to talk about it. And I think that's a great pity as a country, because there is such a thing as English identity. It doesn't have to relate to faith or to ethnicity. It can welcome people as it has over hundreds, indeed thousands of years, from all parts of the world and all different faiths. But I think we do have a sense of what this country actually is. You know, our food, our language, our literature, our landscapes, our particular history, and we should have pride in that. And I don't want to cede that territory to the far right in our country. I want mainstream politicians of the centre-right to be able to talk about this. And although I don't want to draw a direct parallel, I think what you did see, for example, with the thuggery and the riots that we saw earlier in the year, and there's no excuse for that whatsoever, but it did reveal that there are people in our country who feel that they are not listened to, that their voices are not heard. And we should be trying to give voices to people, not the people who are committing the far-right thuggery, but the many, many hundreds of thousands, millions of people beyond that who want Westminster to actually listen and take account of our national identity. And I think it's being eroded. It's being eroded by institutions which tend to denigrate and dismiss our national identity. And it is being eroded by the sheer scale and lack of integration that we're seeing from mass migration. And my argument is it's simply impossible to successfully integrate the numbers of people that we've seen in recent years into our country. You can't successfully integrate 1.2 million people into a country. That's just, no one believes that's possible. And that's what we've had in recent years. I want to change that. So step one is to unwind that and return to a more normal level of migration.
But just tell me a little bit about which you touched on there, some of the institutions perhaps. Why do you think this has been suppressed, or a number of people feel an awkwardness about talking about their Englishness? I mean, going back all the way to Emily Thornberry's infamous tweet from, I think it was the Rochester and Stroud by-election, where she just took a picture of a house which was flying the flag of St George and rather sniffily said, out in Rochester and Stroud, as if it was somehow weird to have the flag of St George flying from your house. Why has it come to this? Who's to blame? Why isn't this as regularly expressed as French or Italian national identity?
Well, I don't think it's just down to Emily Thornberry.
I'd like to blame her for a lot, but I probably can't pin it all on her.
It goes back a long way. I mean, George Orwell wrote about this, 80 or 90 years ago, where I forget I'll misquote him, but he said that England is one of the only countries in the world where its intellectuals decry its history and identity, and so there's a long strand of this going back through our national culture, and it may be for many reasons, because England has been the largest nation within the United Kingdom. But I think it has got more prevalent in recent years, and that worries me. I think we should arrest that. There's a role on all of us in this room as mainstream politicians, as supporters of the great party of the centre-right in our country, to have the courage to talk about this and then to act upon it in our migration policy, in our education policy, in the way we handle and manage our public institutions like the BBC and our museums. Okay.
I'm going to finish up, so people in the audience, get your questions ready, with a few of the challenges that I think you'd immediately face if you prevail in the leadership election and become party leader on November the 2nd. Firstly, about the Grassroots party itself, the voluntary party. Of course, we lost 2/3 of our seats near as damn it on July the 4th. But over the past 20 or so years, we also seem to have lost 2/3 of our members. I think I'm right in saying in the 2001 leadership election, the number of membership ballots issued was north of 300,000. We don't know what it will be this time, perhaps north of 100,000, but not by much. The Grassroots in general, it's certainly my thinking, feel disempowered, unlistened to, not even given the ability to select their own candidates in their own constituencies that they know inside out. Their approach to how we might communicate the Conservative message in their area, often out-trumped by CCHQ. We're in danger of not even being a mass membership party anymore, let alone our the depleted number of people sitting in the Conservative interest in the House of Commons. How would you rectify that and get the party at the non-parliamentary level to grow and thrive again?
Yeah, very good question. Well, look, I mean, I joined this party age 16 in Wolverhampton in 1997. There are not many 16-year-old Conservatives in Wolverhampton in 1997. There are not many Conservatives in Wolverhampton in 1997. And different ways the party has been my family. I've been an association chairman. I've stood in a marginal seat. I fought a by-election that some of you in this room helped me to win. I believe that the membership is the party. And we've got to return CCHQ to the service of the membership. And that's the crucial change here. So it means when you're selecting candidates, no more fixes. You know, you have my solemn vow. I'm not going to parachute in the favoured sons and daughters, the special advisors, the press officers into your constituencies. But I've said, you know, let's abolish the candidates list in the sense that CCHQ's job is to weed out the bad apples. Beyond that, you get the CVs and the applications. You choose who you want to have as your parliamentary candidates and members of parliament. I think there are ways like that we can just show respect for the membership again. I think consistently the membership have been disrespected. I mean, let me give you an example about this leadership election. You know, CCHQ said that the leadership contenders should just do a 10-minute cursory speech on the stage. And beyond that, it should be a sort of in conversation where you get asked what your favourite chocolate biscuit is, or...
I was just about to come on to that.
Oh, come on, all right, so no. I've thought of an answer for that one. You know, that is disrespectful to you, isn't it? Choosing a leader of this party is a big deal. This is someone who wants to be leader of the opposition, aspires to be a future prime minister of this country. Let's not disrespect the membership and the public. Let's do things properly. So I think the culture of the party and its leadership needs to change. That's what I would like to do. Instead on, can a political party be a mass membership organisation? Well, I think the answer is probably yes to that. I think that it is possible, and you only have to look at some other political movements around the world today to see that centre-right parties in much of Europe, in the United States, and in particular in Canada, are actually doing rather well right now. Many of them are on the march. They're attracting members. They're attracting young people. I take a lot of inspiration from the Canadian Conservatives, Pierre Poilievre, who I went to meet a few months ago before the general election. They're doing well.
Yeah.
They are not resiling from traditional Conservative values. They campaign on virtually the same things I do. Secure borders, tough on crime, lower taxes, building homes for young people. I would add in the NHS and public services. They're doing it in a modern way. Great social media. They're trying to reach over the left-leaning media in Canada and speak to people, particularly a younger generation. And they're winning. So I think this is possible if we get this right.
And then the other issue, which I followed your statements with interest on this, as many other areas as well. Look, if we're looking to, form a centre-right government in 2029 and to build support for this great party, the elephant in the room is potentially Reform UK and Nigel Farage, right? I mean, we lost votes all over the place. Some to the Lib Dems, some to Labour, a good number to the sofa of people who just wouldn't go out and vote, but a good chunk to Reform. Now, you've said that your mission as Conservative Party leader would be to put Reform UK and Farage out of business. How would you be going about that? Why are you confident that under your leadership, Reform UK would be, at worst an irritation or a rounding error, rather than a political force that no doubt cost the Conservatives many, many dozens of seats at the last election?
Yeah. Well, in fact, 75% of the seats that we lost at the election, the margin of defeat was less than the Reform vote.
Yeah.
So it's not everything. We've got to do more than that. We've got to get back millions of votes we lost to the Lib Dems and the Labour Party as well. But it's central to the challenge ahead of us. It's the single most important thing we've got to do. My view of Reform is very simple. Reform is a symptom, not a cause. It exists in its present state because we failed. I don't mean you in this room. I mean we in Westminster failed. We made a series of promises, not just in this last Parliament, but my whole adult lifetime, principally on immigration, and we didn't do what we said we were going to do. And that's ultimately why I chose to resign, because I thought when we said we'll do whatever it takes, we should do whatever it takes. And we should try to control and reduce immigration, and we could stop illegal migration. So the answer to me is don't ape Reform, don't welcome Reform in, don't needlessly disparage Reform either, because in a way that's denigrating people who are our people and we want to bring back to us. But let's steal their clothes. Let's have the strongest and clearest policies on the issues that they believe in and we believe in as well. Okay. You know my views, cap on legal migration in the tens of thousands, and the cap is absolutely key, because we said tens of thousands before and we didn't do it. So the cap is the only way in which you can look the public in the eye and say, this is actually going to happen this time. strong approach on illegal migration by leaving the ECHR, and on other allied issues that I campaign on, like crime, like extremism, like integration. If we do that, we suck the oxygen away from reform, and we become the serious party. And then it's all just about personality. If you look at the things that Nigel Farage says about me, all he's left with is, oh, he doesn't sing along to Frankie Valli and punch balloons at the Reform Party conference. It's not the policy, because he knows that I have the policy answers. And if I was leader of this party, there'd be someone with credibility and authenticity and serious answers to these problems running our party. I think that leaves them in quite a difficult place.
Last question from me. Robert, as many of you in the audience will know, I am a betting man. So you are the odds-on favourite to be the next leader of the Conservative Party on November the 2nd. What would you like if that does happen? And I know you won't be counting any chickens at all. There's a long, long way to go. If that does happen, this time next year, where would you have liked to take the party? What are the sort of metrics that you should be judged by? Is it a boost in the opinion polls? Is it much bigger membership? Is it that we've actually got a much more coherent policy platform? What are the sort of things that we might be able to say about a year from now, if you are our new leader, this is how we're going to judge whether Robert Jenrick has had a good first year in office as the leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party?
Well, look, firstly, there is a long way to go with this leadership election. So, in fact, it's in your hands in this room. So, but I'm pleased that we've come where we've come. I mean, I think when the election was called, even Craig Williams wouldn't put a bet on me being the next leader of the Conservative Party. We were like 66 or 100 to 1 or something like that. So we've come a long way. But look, if I was lucky enough to win this, I want to get moving quickly. We've got to reform the operation of the party, as we've just said. Appoint someone of real substance to be chair of this party. We need to ensure that we get candidates selected very quickly, because that needs to begin very soon. And we need to ensure that we get a proper campaigning organisation going again. Because we can't mess around. Because by May, we're going to have county council elections. And as you say, that's a huge test for this party. If we make the wrong choices this autumn, they could be the most challenging elections, perhaps in our party's history. So we've got to get this right very quickly. I want us on these central policy questions around immigration to end this year with crystal clear positions. So nobody could be in any doubt about where our party stands. And we begin that process of bringing people back home to us who are natural small C Conservatives. And then I think we start to talk about all the other things. And I want to begin to instill again professionalism and competence into our party, so that everyone in our country sees us again as a natural party of government. Perfect. And of course, we've got a budget coming up, and I think we've got to sock it to Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer and show them that they have got a serious opposition now, which is going to be holding them to account, at the dispatch box, on the media, out in the country. That's what I want to deliver.
You've suggested that it might be smart for us to get the new leader in place by the budget, but it looks like we're going to have to wait for a few days afterwards, doesn't it?
Well, I've made that argument. I was asked by CCHQ at the beginning of the summer, and I said 100%, whether it's me or somebody else, the next leader of this party needs to be stood at the dispatch box, making the argument to Rachel Reeves, holding to her to account. I do not know for the life of me why this decision has been made. It's very kind of Rishi to agree to do this, but I think it should be the next leader of our party who's making that argument.
Yet another one to file in the mysterious decisions made by CCHQ box, I think. Look, we have got time for a few questions. You know the ground rules. Give us your name. I really want a question. You are allowed a speech, but it must only be one sentence long and it must end in a question mark. Okay? Has everybody got those rules?
Very good.
So let me start with David, James, and then gentleman over there. If you can come to the front row here, and then two there. And we'll come back for another round, don't worry. David.
David Starkey. There are going to be 3 sentences. The first is, we are called PopCon, Popular Conservatism. Isn't what's gone wrong with everything that you've talked about, the ECHR, the Supreme Court, the Quangoisation, a contempt and a deliberate disregard for popular opinion? Is not the only way you can bring it back with a clear, full and developed statement that you believe that the sovereignty of Parliament is fundamentally grounded in popular sovereignty. We've got to recover that idea, and until we do, we are lost.
Thank you. James? Here's second right.
Thank you. James Price, one of those special advisors you waved at who tried with the man next to me to do some of the reforms you mentioned and failed for the reasons you said. I'm completely sympathetic to all the big reforms you said. The one that's missing is the almost crisis now in capitalism in the UK. And you think you did an awful lot to try and do some supply-side reforms in government. Is that as important now? And how do we get capitalism all firing on all cylinders again in the UK?
And then just behind you.
Robert, Richard Patient. You're a YIMBY. How do we get our fellow Conservatives to be YIMBYs?
Great, three easy ones to kick
three
off with.
very
Yep.
simple questions. Well, to David's point, absolutely. Look, the heart of my argument is that our people and our Parliament should be sovereign. You know, I say that in my articles, my speeches. I'm going to say it on Wednesday.
And Labour hates the idea.
Yeah.
of popular
They do,
sovereignty.
they do.
This is what we've to be clear.
Well, also, I decry this term populism. If populism it means not having serious answers to serious challenges, I agree. I want us to be the serious party. That's why I have thought through the things I'm saying. I'm not shooting from the hip about leaving the ECHR. I've devoted time to that. I've spoken to all the legal experts, the interior ministers across Europe. But the idea that politics shouldn't be about coming up with things that answer the legitimate concerns of working people in our country is completely wrong. And I want the Conservative Party to be the trade union for working people in this country and to be coming up with the solutions which make us a popular party. So I don't like it when people say that. To James, your point, sorry, you weren't one of the special advisors I was talking about.
And he's not 25 either.
He's certainly not 25. One of the big challenges is the fact that we've had such low economic growth in our country. And that goes back to the financial crisis and, in fact, before then. The Labour Party talk about being pro-growth. We see scant evidence of that. In fact, most of what they're doing is actually going to be counterproductive. They see this from a very statist perspective and a very unimaginative one. So we have to have a proper growth plan. Now, I believe in cutting taxes. I believe in the dynamic effect of tax cuts. But I also think the hard yards are supply-side reforms. That really is what the Thatcher government did in the 1980s. They were economic reforms, which then led to the ability to cut taxes. And so we have to be a party, to Richard's point, of solving our housing crisis by reforming the planning system, developing a more sensible and pragmatic energy policy, certainly the one that Ed Miliband is producing, giving our young people real skills. I see Nadeem is sat next to you, like apprenticeships rather than just low-value degrees, and getting people off welfare and into work. These are the principal strands that I want us to focus our intellectual energy on in the years ahead as a proper programme for reforming our economy.
And Robert, can I just interject on that? What frustrates me about growth is politicians, particularly of the Labour side, but potentially of all stripes, seem to just sort of wish for growth, as if it's an act of God. Wouldn't it be nice if we had economic growth? But we should be unsurprised, shouldn't we? We've got taxes at the highest level since Clement Attlee. We've regulated more and more activities more and more tightly. Government spending is crowding out private sector activity. Why is anyone remotely surprised that growth is on the floor? We would actually have to reverse those key economic metrics in order to get growth going again. And the regulatory stuff, that's the supply side stuff.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, look, everyone talks about growth, but you can't just wish growth. You've got to actually make it happen.
Yeah.
And sometimes that means hard choices, doesn't it? Don't be surprised if economic growth is low, if there's no homes being built in this country. Don't be surprised if economic growth is low, if we're constantly adding more regulation to the statute book. And when I was an MP and a minister, it was so rare that people came forward with genuine reforms, which actually made life a bit easier for a small business. I mean, I did things like in changing, all small things, but changing use class orders so you can turn your shop into your hairdressers, into your cafe. If it's empty for 3 months, you can turn it into a home. I said, let's build upwards 2 stories on every house if it's appropriate to do so. I said, let's turn every pub and restaurant into a takeaway overnight during COVID. Let's put outdoor tables and chairs in every marketplace and high street in our country. And in almost every instance, All sorts of people said, oh, this is completely outrageous, it will destroy high streets, or what about this or that or the other. So few ministers seem to do those things. And then there's this avalanche of other things that people are saying, like, let's regulate, Airbnbs, or let's regulate anyone who wants to be a landlord. And obviously there's always an argument behind these things, but cumulatively, it just stifles business, entrepreneurship in our country, and suppresses growth. So you have to have a totally different mindset, I think, the next time we're in office.
Maybe take a few more questions. Shall I go? I'm going to go to the back of the room over here. So there's a lady there, and then just behind you, and then I'll come to the front of the room. So those two, and then Philip at the front. Again, if you could introduce yourself, one sentence with a question mark at the end.
Yeah, hello, Robert. I'm Jane Emerson from Bethnal Green and Stepney in East London. How would you tackle the problems in the NHS? Because we just seem to keep pouring millions into the NHS and we're not getting the service the quality we deserve. How would you tackle the NHS problem?
And then just behind you.
Afternoon, Robert. David Bamford. Nobody's talking about, we've talked about our borders, but against the backdrop of the Chinese launching the equivalent of a Royal Navy every 22 months, what would your view be on defence spending?
Okay. And then we can come to the front. Sorry, you're getting your steps in, Chris. Yeah.
Philip Season Oliver, Chairman of Westminster North. It was just talked about the candidates department, really. I know you previously mentioned about CCHQ. One of the things I think we fail to appreciate is that when you have a SIFT committee, how the voluntary members are often quashed by the CCHQ representative. It's quite a sort of domineering process, and how are you going to create neutrality on that process? And just going on to George Orwell, it's, I believe the middle classes would sooner steal from the poor box than sing for the national anthem.
Oh, there you go. That might be the line.
Very good. Very good. Well, on your point about candidates, I mean, I've set out my position very clearly. The SIFT committee, if by that you mean CCHQ, that is over. The end. What we're going to have is a different system. We're going to have a system where you apply to be a candidate. CCHQ's job is to weed out the bad apples, because we've got people
just like a criminal records bureau check, that kind of
exactly.
thing. Yeah, yeah.
Because we're a serious political party. We can't have people who are going to let down our brand. However, then somebody retires. There's a seat coming up that's winnable. Whatever. You apply for something. Everyone's CVs get sent to your local association. They're in the driving seat. They choose who they want to shortlist. They want to vote for. That strikes me as an altogether more democratic system than the one we have at the end. Fundamental change. And to David's question at the back, which was, sorry, remind me, that was...
defence spending.
Oh, defence spending, apologies. Look, we all agree, I think, that we live in an increasingly dangerous world. We all agree that we should be spending more money on our defence. I think that it's incredibly important that Europe steps up and takes more responsibility for its defence. There's this debate about, well, is Donald Trump going to be president of the United States or Kamala Harris? Look, whoever is president of the United States, the generational challenge for America is going to be China. And so the resources and the capacity of the United States is going to be ever more driven towards China and the Pacific. So we in the UK and our allies in Europe are going to have to spend more money on defence, and are going to have to work more closely together. And I want the UK to be one, if not the principal defence powers of Europe. That means spending more money. I'm a fiscal conservative. I don't think you can just say that without coming up with some suggestions, at least, as to how you might begin to do that. So I have said for some time that I would take money from our international aid budget and I would spend it on our armed forces. I think that is, in a world of hard we would all like to do everything in life, wouldn't we? But in a world of hard choices, that is a better way in which the UK can protect the interests of its own citizens. And I think with the benefit of hindsight, it was a bad policy that we had, where we increased our aid budget in real terms over the last 14 years, but we decreased the budget of our armed forces. That was bad. That was not in the interest of the British people. I take a sort of Gaullist approach to defence and foreign policy. I've got a certain idea of what the interests of this country are. I will always put them first. And then on the NHS, a big question, but I'll just say two things, because I know time is short. Firstly, if Wes Streeting, who likes to talk the talk, comes forward with genuine reforms which would boost productivity, would improve the quality of care for patients in our country, which are demonstrably in the national interest, I think we should back him. I think the public would welcome that, and it would make us look like a mature opposition. There's not going to be any shortage of fronts in which we can fight this government. If there's one in which we can show the maturity of opposition, I think we should do it. I'm sceptical that that will happen, but I think we should do it. Overall, my approach on the NHS is that we should stop treating it as a religion to be worshipped, and we should treat it as a public service. It strikes me that for much of the last 14 years, we were afraid of our own shadows. We were more obsessed by inputs than outputs. Yeah. We boasted about the money we put in, but we didn't think carefully about what this was actually doing for patients and the taxpayer. So we need to treat it differently in the years ahead.
Robert, we're about out of time. I'm going to finish with one question from the chair. We've reflected on what a low ebb the Conservative Party is at, just 121 seats, a diminished membership base, failed to get even 25% of the total national vote in the polls. If you do prevail on November the 2nd, do you think we can actually win the next election outright? Or are we in some long, tortuous journey back like we had after the 1997 defeat that could take a decade or more? Or do you genuinely, in your heart of hearts, think you could be Prime Minister by 2029?
I do. Look, I would not be putting myself forward for this, and frankly, nobody should do, unless they believe in their core that we can do this, that we can turn this around. I would just say this. The first party conference I went to was in 2005, and I watched David Cameron deliver that speech. Two thoughts came into my mind back then. Somebody asked me what was I thinking as a young Conservative at the time. With hindsight, two things. One, this was somebody who was young and energetic and had genuine vision for the future of our party and our country, and that was good news. But secondly, why have we waited 8 years to come with someone who could be a future Prime Minister, has a plan, is willing to talk some hard truths, and wants to take this party forward to victory? So my message to all of you in this room, and in fact to everyone at this conference, is don't mess around. Let's get this right first time. Let's admit where we got things wrong. Let's do the hardest thing of all in politics, which is to say we didn't get it right on the NHS, the economy. We didn't get it right on our borders. Let's learn lessons now, and let's bring forward a clear plan. I have a diagnosis of what's gone wrong. I have a plan to fix it, and I'd like to think I've got the energy and the determination to get it done.
Robert, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
I know you've got an absolutely crazy diary. We're really pleased here at PopCon you've managed to take an hour out of your time to speak to us. I hope we gave you exactly the level of scrutiny that you were looking for. Not too hot, not too cold, Goldilocks right. Good luck with the rest of your campaign and the rest of the conference. Ladies and gentlemen, Robert Jenrick.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much.